We all want the lights to go on when we throw the switch and our TV sets to have power when we need them. But electricity plays a much bigger role than that. It provides the energy to keep industry rolling, to keep commercial businesses open, to keep airlines flying, to keep hospitals and medical technology functioning, and to do so many other things that we depend on every day. How do we plan for a future that will depend on electric power? We're going to discuss that today with a person who has that responsibility in the state of Michigan. Starts right now.
From TV6, this is the Ryan Report. Now, here's your host, Don Ryan.
Well, Valerie Brighter is the executive director of the Michigan Agency for Energy. Her service with the current administration began in 2011. She previously served as deputy legal counsel and senior policy advisor to Governor Rick Snyder. Before her service in state government, she was a partner at Bodman PLC, practicing primarily environmental and corporate law. She was also an environmental consultant to the EPA and Department of Defense. Brighter received degrees from Harvard, Radcliffe, from Oxford University, and from the Georgetown Law Center. We're pleased to have Director Brighter as our guest this morning. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
Very nice to have you with us. You know, you have outstanding qualifications. What made you decide you want to use your energies in government?
Well, I really did think this was an unusual opportunity to work with Governor Snyder. He's one of the rare politicians who's really interested in what things will be like in 30 years, not just while he's in office. And if you're interested in energy, every decision you make is a 40-year decision, not a 3-year decision. So being able to work with someone who thinks like that was a really exciting opportunity.
And talk about the fact that about a year ago he decided to establish the Michigan Agency for Energy. What does he hope to accomplish with that?
Well, there are many things we hope to accomplish, including having more interagency activities and information. But one of the impetus for it was what was happening here in the UP, where decisions were getting made at regional bodies and at the federal level that severely impacted residents. And because the Michigan Public Service Commission might have to approve certain parts of it, it couldn't always be a strong advocate without endangering its own jurisdiction. So by having an agency that does policy, we can make sure that Michigan's interests are always represented without giving up our own powers to do it.
So you can be more of an advocate agency than the Public Service Commission could be?
Right, because we don't regulate anyone. You don't have to get our approval for anything,
Right.
But that lets us really argue for what's best for Michigan without impeding our ability to make decisions later.
Before we talk about a few of these issues, let's give people a little history and maybe some understanding. There are a couple of organizations, let's say, that play a big role in this. One is FERC. Tell us what FERC does.
So the FERC is the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. So whenever you've got an interstate electricity issue, they have primary jurisdiction. So when it comes to the huge wires that really bring power in across, the ones you see next to highways often, they actually regulate those, where the little wires that bring power to your house, that would be a state duty.
Okay. The other organization is MISO, and they're really not a government organization, are they?
No, they're in fact made up entirely on the voting members of for-profit or entities that provide electricity. So your only nonprofits, and that would be co-ops or municipal utilities that belong. But it's primarily companies that have as some aspect of their business electricity that travels over the grid.
But they still have a lot of power, let's say, to make decisions.
They do. The federal government has really empowered them to operate the grid, to make decisions about costs associated with that. Those decisions can be appealed to the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, who can overrule MISO, but in first instance they make the decisions, and often they go into effect before you would have a chance to appeal them.
Let's see how these organizations came into play. A little bit of history here. I think probably back in perhaps 2011, We Energies first introduced the idea that they might consider doing something different with the Prescott power plant, including closing it. Then in 2013, Cliffs Natural Resources took away the contract they had with We Energies, took on another supplier. That set a lot of things in motion. Tell us what happened there.
Well, that accelerated the decision by We Energies to close the plant. They announced that they wanted to close it, but it's crucial for reliability, as folks who remember when it got flooded out, what that was like will know. Without that plant operating, the UP grid can't really operate. And so when that happens, what MISO does is pay people to keep them running. And those decisions are made in the first instance by MISO, and the only people who know what's really going on are the company and the grid operator, MISO. The rest of us can't really see what the negotiations are.
And that we call an SSR. Right?
Yes, those payments are called SSR, System Support Resources.
So in general, it's a reasonable thing that if you're forcing any company to continue to operate for reliability purposes, they should have some opportunity to regain money they might lose.
That is definitely the theory. One thing that has concerned us is that those systems were really designed for places where people don't have an obligation to serve customers. In Michigan, we thought that We Energies had an obligation to serve its customers and to provide the infrastructure that was necessary to do that. And one of the things we're excited about now is that we really feel like that obligation is going to be fulfilled without having to go to court for years to argue about it.
First of all, about a year ago, I think, you began this process, and there was an agreement between Cliffs and We Energies, and the governor was involved to do something which brought Cliffs back into the fold for We Energies. And so since then, it's been kind of a twisting and turning road, I think, to get to where we are today.
Well, but a planned road. So, yeah, I remember well when we were negotiating this, because we negotiated it, including on New Year's Eve, telephone calls from 9 until 5. The night before the governor was inaugurated, we were still negotiating this deal. We were able to get some really good things in motion, and the settlement agreement provided for Plans A, Plan B, Plan C, because we didn't want a series of problems. We wanted a series of steps to bring forward a solution, and that's what this has done.
Okay, well, we'll find out where that road took us in just a minute. We'll be back with more on the Ryan Report after we take this break. We're talking with Valerie Braider, the Executive Director of the Michigan Agency for Energy. We were talking about how we're heading down a road to making some major improvements in the power situation. This week, the governor and others announced that we have a plan now to provide power for the Cliffs Tilden mine. Talk to us about that.
There's a good proposed solution, we think, which is to have not just one plant, but 2 plants made up of smaller engines called RICE engines. They're natural gas engines that you can actually bring in on a locomotive. They're a little bit portable. And by having 2 different locations, we think that that's going to provide a really nice reliability. These engines start up really quickly, so that's good. And they really create room to grow for the UP in smaller bites, which is how we tend to see economic development come. Not in huge projects like Cliffs, but in smaller projects.
Do we have any idea where these plants are going to be located? I know that's a big question on the mind of a lot of people.
Yeah, those locations aren't fixed. There are 3 locations that are being explored, all of which would likely work, and 2 of which will be used right now, and a 3rd likely to be available for future growth. So they're working right now to secure land rights and go through the process of making sure that electrically those sites work well. But we know we've got 3 sites and we only need 2, so high confidence that we'll be able to locate them in the best spots.
I'm sure natural gas is one of the big factors you have to consider.
It is. We do believe a new compressor station will have to be built, but otherwise Cliffs has, of course, natural gas that it used to use for Empire that it will no longer need to use, and it's dedicated that to this project.
And transmission would be another issue, I assume.
Yes, but they've actually selected these locations so that we don't expect there to have to be much transmission investment. We'll be checking that with MISO to make sure we're right, but that will be one of the big bonuses to this, is that we will not have to spend hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars in transmission for this plant.
Okay. Let's talk about something else, and that is getting back to the SSR. You and the state of Michigan have brought charges, I guess maybe charges is the right word, but you believe that the SSR payments were overpaid to We Energies.
Radically overpaid.
Radically overpaid. Talk to us about that.
We think they were at least double what they should have been. One of our biggest criticisms has been that because the way the federal system's set up, the deal is cut in secret, you don't really have a chance to put those charges to the smell test before they start assigning them to people. And there were just huge levels of expenses, millions and millions of dollars for improvements that were never made. So we have appealed those. We've been fighting them for years now at FERC, and we were really happy to see that the initial determination, which isn't final, is very much in ratepayers' favor and should result in at least $17 million less than was otherwise going to be charged.
And you had a favorable ruling from a judge in this case, a judge for FERC?
Yes, FERC has two levels. They have an administrative law judge who sort of goes through all the evidence and makes a recommendation, then the commissioners themselves who make the decision. So the initial judge's recommendation is very much in our favor. We still think even more money's owed, so we're fighting that, but we will be taking that up to FERC, and we hope very much that they recognize that the UP was radically overcharged and they affirm the lower judge and frankly give even more dollars that UP residents are owed.
And you were very critical of MISO. You'd like them to change their way of doing business?
Absolutely, and to MISO's credit, it has recognized that this system is unfair and recommended that they no longer do these deals in secret. They need FERC to agree. And we're very eager for FERC to agree that doing these kind of deals in secret is un-American.
So you have to work with this organization going forward.
We do.
The governor has called again recently for MISO to look at maybe expanding its footprint, or at least looking beyond its footprint, especially in the Upper Peninsula and beyond region. What is he hoping to accomplish here?
Well, we've had a lot of changes in infrastructure, and so is Canada, just across the Soo. And what we think is it may be possible that if we better connected Canada, the Upper Peninsula, and the Lower Peninsula, we could have a project that pays for itself, that lowers everyone's rates so much that it would be silly not to do it. But in order to test that, MISO has to do some studies on the technical and cost implications for that. We've asked them to do that, and we're very hopeful that they will say yes.
Okay. And related to SSR, you also have some favorable news coming out of White Pine.
Yes.
What's happening there?
Well, we have a unit there that, despite receiving SSR payments, has not shown up when we needed it, including during a hydrogen leak. We're very excited that they've been able to figure out a way to reconfigure the system to actually not need White Pine in order to meet our stringent reliability reasons. And so instead of ordering White Pine, which had wanted to retire years ago, to stay up until 2020 against their will, we'll be able to actually allow them to shut down, I believe, this year. There's one more study to make sure it does what we think it does, but we're very hopeful that very, very soon we'll be able to stop those payments. And that's $7.3 million that was coming out of UP ratepayers every year that will stop dead. We're also appealing our past charges because we think they overcharged us too, another secret deal.
One of the issues that's been around for a long time is the issue of Michigan Public Service Commission, Wisconsin Public Service Commission issues that affect customers in the UP. Are we working our way through that?
Yeah, I think those have always been a little bit overblown. You know, some of these expenses to the transmission system would be paid for by Wisconsin under current rules. Obviously, there's been a lot of back and forth on who pays what percentage of the SSR. But the truth is, you know, we've been together for a long time, the UP and Wisconsin electrically, since the 30s. We'll be together going forward. And I know that our Public Service Commission and the Public Service Commission of Wisconsin do talk. We may have disagreements, just like we occasionally do with MISO. It doesn't mean we can't work together in the long term. We
Energies is attempting to establish a separate UP subsidiary. Will that help?
In our view, it is neither necessary nor a problem for the deal that we've announced to really put the UP on good footing going forward. So we remain confident that our Public Service Commission will make the right decision, and we'll leave that decision to them.
Okay. I want to talk about some broader issues in the state of Michigan for electric power. We'll get to those in just a couple of minutes. Back with more on the Ryan Report after we take this break. Our guest this morning is Valerie Braider, Executive Director of the Michigan Agency for Energy. That was right, yes. Let's talk about Michigan energy planning. Probably early last year, Governor Snyder called on the legislature to come up with an energy plan for the state. We're still waiting for it to happen. Are we making some progress?
Well, yeah, you do have bills on both the House floor and the Senate floor, so out of committee. They have slightly different approaches, but a lot of similar issues, and we'll still be working very hard through the year to understand how changes in federal policy affect those. And there's a lot of behind-the-scenes agreement on some pieces that maybe being held back a little by some of those that there is an agreement on yet. But we continue to want to work with people to find those win-win solutions.
Well, I was listing those agencies with the initials that are important. EPA is certainly one.
Yeah.
And you know, their regulations are certainly affecting the power industry. Do we really see kind of an end to the generation of electric power with coal?
I think that at this point, building a new coal plant would be highly unlikely due to EPA regulations, having them be just enormously cost prohibitive. So the real question is, how long will existing coal plants hang on? A lot of them won't hang on very long, you know, because if they break or if they're reaching the end of their lives, it doesn't make a lot of sense to re-up them. But some of them are, you know, big workhorses that are very cost effective, and they may run for decades. So it'll be interesting to see, but I think new coal plants are highly unlikely.
One of the big issues is choice. First of all, explain to our viewers what choice involves.
Basically, it allows about 10% of people for every utility to go out and buy their energy from some other company and pay just the cost for the wires and other things to their traditional utility. But 90% of folks are required to stay with the normal provider for both.
And that's one of the big issues, I think, that's kind of a stumbling block here. I think the major utilities would prefer not to have choice, and obviously there are some customers who want to be able to continue to use that service.
Yeah, so what the administration has said is we understand that a lot of these customers, which a lot of our big industries are among them, really depend on the lower prices they can get. The problem is that one reason those prices are lower is because it's like them not buying insurance. You know, your car would be a lot cheaper to operate if you didn't have to have that insurance policy. Electricity is the same way. We just want everyone to have an insurance policy so that we get the plants built that need building. And there are ways to do that for the folks and still let them buy their energy on the market. And that's what the governor is supporting.
And isn't one of the issues still renewable power and keeping the focus on that as well?
You know, it's interesting, when the renewable mandate was passed in Michigan, it was assumed that renewables would be more expensive than traditional generation. What we found for the vast majority of Michigan companies is that it's equally or cheaper in the expense to traditional generation. So we've always had this idea, and we're still struggling to break out of it, that if you don't mandate it, it doesn't happen. But what we see is that if you allow it to compete on equal footing and you recognize some of the values that it does bring, it actually wins on price and on kind of long-term outlook.
We only have a moment left, but what brought you here on this particular trip was a meeting of the 21st Century Infrastructure Commission. Tell us what the governor hoped to accomplish with that, appointed just earlier this year.
Really wants to look at all sorts of infrastructure, roads, wastewater, energy, telecom, broadband, and really set some goals for the state and look at them holistically and find ways that we can advance them all. You know, here in the UP, obviously we struggle with broadband access, but you've also got one of the most innovative next-gen 911 systems in the country. So we want to make sure that where we've got successes, we know how to replicate them, and where we've got areas where we need to improve, we identify them and really get our economy on a long-term path with the infrastructure it needs to succeed.
Well, it's a complicated subject, to say the least. There are a lot of issues and a lot of important issues being dealt with right now by you and Governor Snyder. Appreciate your coming in this morning to talk with us about it.
We love to talk about them. Thanks for having us.
Okay. I'll be back with some other thoughts on the Ryan Report after we take this break. Let me tell you about a dream I had the other night. In this dream, I woke up one morning and realized immediately that something wasn't right. It turns out I overslept because my alarm hadn't gone off. But that was just the beginning of a stressful morning. It turns out the electric power had gone out right after I fell asleep that night, and my alarm didn't go off because I'd forgotten to replace the backup batteries. I jumped from my bed and got in the shower, where I was greeted by a stream of cool water because the electric water heater had stopped working hours before. Needless to say, the hairdryer wasn't available either. I left the bathroom and headed for the kitchen and was faced with the realization that the electric coffee maker was not working. I put some bread in the toaster, but of course it also depended on electricity, so I was out of luck. I went to the refrigerator to get some juice and realized it was warming up in there and the food in the freezer was starting to thaw. That's something I would have to deal with later. I tried to use the electric can opener to give the dog some food, but of course it wouldn't work. There were a number of things a little strange about this dream, including the fact that I don't have a dog, but we can't always explain our dreams. I wanted to know what was going on, so I went to check out the television news, but of course the television set wouldn't work. I reached for the radio, but the local radio stations were off the air because the power outage was widespread and they need electricity to make their equipment operate. Without electric power, my desktop computers wouldn't work and the batteries were dead in my laptop. The same was true of my cell phone. I had put on the charger before I went to bed, but without power it failed to charge. I was scheduled to fly out on a business trip that day, and despite the fact that I overslept, still had time to make it to the airport if I hurried. Of course, I was delayed trying to get out of my car out of the garage because the garage door opener wouldn't work. I raced to the airport, risking a ticket for breaking the basic speed limit, and if there are any law enforcement officers watching, I would remind them this was just a dream, not something I would actually do. I got to the airport just under the wire, walked up to the check-in desk, only to learn that the flights weren't flying because the computer systems were down because of the power failure. I put my head on the counter and cried. I woke up from that dream a little shaken by the experience. I quickly checked to make sure my TV set, computer, cell phone, and everything else I depended on were there and working. As I sat there, I thought back to the time I was a young boy living with my grandparents. We had power failures back then, but about the only consequence of that was the lights went out. It was a different world we live in today. I'll be back in 2 minutes. It's about time to wrap things up and make way for the Today Show. Remember that UpperMichiganSource.com is the place to go for the latest news, sports, and weather. It's also where you can find the Ryan Report. The current week's show is usually there by Monday afternoon. Thanks to Valerie Braider for joining us this morning. Electric energy is critically important to Michigan's future, and she's in the middle of the discussion as major decisions are considered. Thanks for joining us today. Look forward to seeing you again next Sunday morning.